Welcome to the Bruton Knowles Landmark Podcast, where we explore the key dynamics shaping the property sector and beyond, with insights from those working at the heart of the UK's built environment. In today's episode, we're turning our attention to the public sector, a space where Bruton Knowles has been working in partnership for decades, helping local authorities, emergency services, NHS trusts and government departments manage, value and make the most of their estates. It's a sector under real pressure, facing funding challenges, skill shortages, the drive towards decarbonisation and net zero, and the growing complexities of potential devolution. Joining me to unpack all of these are our public sector specialists Guy Emmerson, Development and Planning Faculty Head, and Ian Mercer, Head of Development. We'll discuss how the sector is evolving, the realities behind the financial headlines, and how consultancies like Bruton Knowles can help overstretched authorities focus on deliverable, commercially grounded outcomes. We'll also look at how devolution and strategic authorities are reshaping local priorities and what that means for property teams on the ground. So, whether you work in local government, development or property consultancy, or just want to understand how the public estate can unlock community value, this episode is for you. Let's get started. So, BK has a long history in the public sector. I think the three of us on this podcast have done, many years of consultancy work for a range of public sector bodies. And for those listening, when we say the public sector, what do we mean? What we actually mean is local authorities, so that's at borough, district and unitary level, emergency services, which we tend to call blue light organisations for obvious reasons, the NHS and government departments. This represents part of our annual turnover as a business, and we tend to act on an annualised basis in excess of 100 organisations. Importantly, for us, as a general practice, we deliver all of our general practice skills to this client sector. So that will include valuation, development consultancy, landlord and tenant, agency, building consultancy, and CPO across residential, commercial, and rural property. So for us, it's an all-embracing sector as we deliver, as I've said, all of our skill sets into that sector. Guy and Ian, picking on Guy first, what's your sort of experience of the public sector? Do you want to bring it alive a little bit for those listening?
Yeah, sure. I think it's worth pointing out that, we were one of the first consultancies to take on long-term and fully outsourced estate management contracts back in the 1990s, which is when I joined. And, I'm sort of proud to say that we continue to act for some of those clients even today. For me, I think the longest running series of contracts was 27 years, consecutive years, which I guess is pretty unheard of in the public sector, but obviously punctuated by a large number of procurement exercises within that. And for me, generally work for county councils, done a lot of work around Buckinghamshire in the past, Surrey County at the moment, as well as a number of others. And one of my particular remits, along with colleagues, is to carry out work for the local district and borough councils, particularly for their planning departments in viability jobs in particular. Yeah, a lot of it is sort of characterised by these long-term relationships. We're nearly always supporting an in-house team at one level or another. And personally, I enjoy working with these teams. I think I find them staffed by very capable and dedicated people. And, perhaps contrary to a urban myth, they work very long hours in order to get work done. So it's an enjoyable part of the workload.
How about you, Ian?
Okay, thanks very much, everybody. Well, I've been working for, I suppose, the public sector for the best part of 20 odd years. Probably the first contract I became involved with was Wolverhampton City Council. That was probably about 2003, which was on a framework agreement. And we've carried on working for Wolverhampton City Council, not in exactly the same vein, but in a similar way, ever since. And through those initial contacts with Wolverhampton City, it sort of spawned other contacts through those who were originally in Wolverhampton back in 2003. And it's evolved as as an involvement across the West Midlands, to include the likes of Warwickshire County Council, Warwick District Council, and I do think that, one of the benefits of working with the public sector and fully putting the effort in to understand what they're about is you do build these good long-term successful relationships. And through that, you do feel as though you take a lot more from the work that you're involved with, and you become that much more involved with the work that you're delivering, as opposed to a one-off valuation.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think over time you build up a relationship and there's lots of trust there. I think I think it also demonstrates that it's not a criticism, it's an observation that things in the public sector can take an awful long time to deliver. Hence, we're on board for a very long time trying to deliver it. And that's for lots of reasons around funding and politics, etc. I think it's important to say as well that certainly in terms of our CPO skill set, we deliver that across the whole of the UK for all types of organisations, whether it's road schemes. We love a bypass at Bruton Knowles, we think they're great, or whether it's things around urban redevelopment, which tends to be small scale to medium scale CPO, where there's just improvements or demolition of unsightly and derelict areas where the local authority is trying to pump prime regeneration. And they see that, well, it is in fact an important role for them to link in on the fringes of the public sector and the private sector to bring forward schemes that perhaps otherwise wouldn't, and to improve and target areas that are very often down at heel and do need major improvement through redevelopment of the real estate. So for us, CPO takes us across England, Scotland and Wales, and the consultancy work is pretty broad at Bruton Knowles. Certainly our rural team very busy in the southwest at the moment in terms of this kind of consultancy advice they're providing for rural estate teams, which again tend to mirror the normal estates team, often short on full resource, and we're able to provide a combination of expertise and resource that helps the team function properly on a day-to-day basis. It's not all about strategic. Often what we're doing is filling in gaps that enables the local authority to deliver better.
Yeah, and not to forget the fact that we do an awful lot of asset valuations for the public sector, again, across the country, and that, all these issues sort of explain why we are acting for upwards of 100 organisations annually, which is an impressive figure, doing all manner of work from, very large scale development sales down to, individual property valuations. It is a surprisingly wide-ranging skill set, and Ian and I in particular, we work as part of public sector team. Whilst we focus on development activity, there is a lot more that goes with that. It gives us a diverse range of work, but also exposes us to a diverse range of clients.
So that's the good bit, that's the bit that we enjoy. We can move on to the sector issues now, because the public sector is something that appears in the wider realm very often for lots of reasons, some of them often quite negative around local authority funding and issues around that. In terms of the sector itself, from our perspective, certainly some of the work that I've done, we can see some of the issues around funding are decarbonisation and net zero, which has now been placed upon them as a challenge to hit their numbers by the deadline date. We've got devolution playing out. We've touched on already resource levels, depth of skill base. And then, of course, there's the political constraints, which I always describe as politics with a small p, as they tend to play out locally. But they are there and you can't ignore them because they don't exist in the commercial world. So we'll come on to that in a little while, because it does come into play and it does impact how decision making is taken, doesn't it?
James, can I sort of come in there? Because, I often say to, people I work with in the public sector, as compared to, the private sector, where we also have a very significant involvement on a day-to-day basis as well. In the private sector, you have one client. That's the client. The public sector, who we work with, they have three parties, or three clients, if you like. They have the members, they have the matter itself, and then they have the taxpayers that they're having to ensure all the work is delivered to best value. So they have all these sort of issues which are not obscuring, but are impacting upon the work that they are involved with, that we are becoming involved with. And I think being sympathetic to that is part of the long-term, not skill, but it's the long-term rapport that we're seeking to develop with our clients. So we're understanding the problems, the restrictions, and the problems that they're having on a day-to-day basis, as opposed to other people who are too quick to bash the public sector, because I honestly think a lot of people don't fully understand the problems that they're working to, or they're having to work within.
I think that's right, Ian. I think the key word you said there is understanding. I think we've developed over the years a fine understanding, really, of the nuances of how public sector works in terms of its property function, the funding around it, the decision making. I mean, at one level, there's certainly a lot of scrutiny goes on. I mean, I don't think they can ever be criticised for not taking the time and the trouble to scrutinise, to consult, to understand the dynamics of what they're trying to do. I think people sometimes are a little bit unrealistic in expecting things to be done really, really quickly, because it doesn't work like that. The decision, as we know, when we produce work for our clients, that then goes into another layer of scrutiny. So it's often scrutinised by specialist committees, directors, before it then goes on to the actual decision-making board.
Yeah, well, I do remember when I was seconded, to City Council back in the 90s. One of the things that I very, very quickly appreciated was, and I hadn't appreciated before that secondment, were effectively how many teams are involved in the delivery of, for example, a regeneration project. It's not through, and it's just through necessity that all those individual teams and all those different parts of the council have to be involved in that process. It's unavoidable, and that in of itself, requires a different level of management, a different level of skill, doesn't it? And it always does have an impact upon the timeliness with which projects are going to be delivered, because there are more people involved in that process. And I think one of the things that we can now demonstrate, can't we, because of our long-term involvement, is that you mentioned it, James, minutes ago, is that understanding.
Yeah, and it's where to assist, isn't it? I think what we understand really, really well is those pressure points, and how, as property advisors, we can a lot of it is predicated around understanding values and market sentiment and market demand and supply. If you can provide that information at an early decision-making stage, it certainly helps, because I think what people are trying to grapple with in the public sector is what is the reality around deliverability, because a lot of things are aspirational, there's no doubt about it, but aspiration's one thing. Can you actually deliver it within the constraints of your funding and the politics that are around your local authority?
Guy, forgive me for mentioning this, but a few years ago, we actually gave a presentation on agency work. And funny enough, it was in Wolverhampton. And Guy made he made a few points, Guy, but one in particular was about expectation. And I think managing expectation is a key part of working successfully with the public sector, isn't it? In terms of, what is a piece of land truly worth? What is it going to deliver that land to the market? And that's part of the due diligence process, isn't it, Guy?
Yeah, no, I think it is. I think that is a very important part of our sort of general understanding. But at a higher level than all of that is just trying to understand the pressures that they are under. I mean, everything for them ultimately goes back to funding, or rather a lack of funding. And, it is just fact that there have been such significant cuts to grant funding. I think I'm right in saying, up to 40% between 2010 and 2020 in certain areas. But at the same time, a really significant increase in demand for, the services they have to deliver. So adult and children's social care is is a big one. Temporary accommodation, homelessness, that's another big one.
Yeah.
And the simple truth is that the cost of delivering services is increasing, but the funding is reducing.
And the resource levels are far lower than they used to be.
And the resource levels are lower, yeah. I mean, when you look at just, because it's been in the news recently, but just looking at the welfare budget as a country, that's, I don't know, it's 300 billion. It's 10% of 11% of GDP, and it's going to get higher. Having to provide all these services at increasing cost with reducing funding inevitably means, financial strain is the polite way of putting it, but there've been a number of well-publicised bankruptcies, haven't there?
Well, that's how it's playing out, isn't it? I mean, the truth is, you've got, there's 6 at the moment, and there'll be more coming down the track of well-publicised local authorities, including my own in Nottingham, Northamptonshire, Slough, Croydon, Thurrock, Woking, Birmingham. The list will go on where, technically, they don't have enough money to discharge their services.
No, and part of that is a current lack of long-term funding, because I think it is all relatively short-term, and that doesn't really give them the ability to plan and spend in a sensible way. As a whole, I think there's something like £122 billion in debt, local authorities, if you take them all as a whole, which is an enormous number. And of course, they've got little room to manoeuvre, have they? They either get more funding or they have to do something like increase council tax or business rates, and this is where we come in, sell property and land to sort of help reduce their borrowings. Inevitably, further bankruptcies are almost inevitable, and maybe, just maybe, that's where devolution comes in, because I think the hope is that that's going to bring a lot more efficiencies at a larger scale. And, you can see that ought to happen. But I don't really think anyone should underestimate the sheer cost of delivering devolution up and down the country. So there's a bit of a query in my mind as to whether the net savings are likely to be that significant, certainly in the short term. Yeah. And of course, what I've not yet got my head around is what happens in the interim period to service delivery. Can people really fully maintain service delivery during that transition? And it's simply from a property perspective, because we can look at it like that. Just imagine how difficult it might be to merge 3 or 4 property teams into one that have all got different IT systems, all got different data policies, record keeping is probably variable. And of course, you've got the issue around resourcing those property teams. And inevitably, attention's just going to be drawn away from the ongoing projects whilst all of that gets sorted out. And what I slightly fear is that we know that the property teams that we work with have got an enormous amount of granular knowledge of their respective portfolios, possibly more than is written down. It's got to be really important to maintain that knowledge moving forward. But hopefully, looking at it positively, devolution could release economies of scale. That should release opportunities for local communities, and we hope to be at the heart of that when it does come, and focus on actual delivery of those projects.
Yeah, taking a step back, I think you made a good point there, Guy, about the current funding, because certainly some of the work I've done for local authorities, what tends to happen is money comes out on an annualised basis from government on a bid basis. So each year it's on a different basis. Each year you're different for bidding for different criteria. There's no consistency to it whatsoever. So you can't plan even short term, because government moves the goalposts every year. And it just depends on what the emphasis is actually on. But it's been really interesting when we've been working with Nottingham City Council in terms of looking at their portfolio and valuing it, so they can assess, really what can they dispose of, what can they develop. You come across an interesting scenario where there's an awful lot of clawbacks to various other government departments, whether it's adult care services, etc., where it's government that's funded the redevelopment of the building or the refurbishment. So you can't sell it for full market value, because you've then got to pay a clawback back to that government department. And it was very surprising to myself and my colleagues just how many of those properties within the portfolio fit within that criteria. It demonstrates that money comes out of government in a really ad hoc way. Each local authority has to bid on an annualised basis, which isn't good. I mean, that can't be an ideal way of doing it. So
yeah. Also, James, I think at the moment, I'm right in saying that local authorities' budget is based on an annual budget, isn't it? So in other words, you either spend the money within your annual budget or you lose it. Now, I would think that's, if we look at our own sort of management of money, having to sort of spend money quickly to risk losing it is not a great idea. So in other words, having budgets set over a longer period of time will actually only help the budgetary process and the better use of long-term spending and the planning of spending.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And one thing I didn't really realise was that grant funding, central government grant funding is generally based on population, but the population figures date back to 2013. So if you're in an area that's seen significant housing development and population growth, you're sort of already behind the curve until that all gets updated. And no doubt that's part of the devolution conversations that will happen. But other than savings, I'm not sure what other funding there is. I know there's £600 million announced recently, but I'm not really sure whether it answers the fundamental question of there's not enough money to deliver all the services, but we can only hope that devolution improves that.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that concerns me, Guy, if we're looking at the sort of the swift selling of property, I mean, on the one hand, yes, it is sensible as part of a strategic plan to dispose of certain properties that, perhaps their use is no longer a sort of frontline requirements, et cetera, but you can only sell properties once. And once they're sold, that's it. And I honestly think, rather than having a fire sale, which isn't based upon a good long-term plan, there may well then be regret in hindsight because the sale of that property then fundamentally impacts upon delivering a longer-term regeneration scheme. So it's that compromise, isn't it, as between, a forced fire sale to raise money quickly, as opposed to deliverability or delivery rather of a long-term strategy, which is perhaps what you can do if you have the luxury of being able to plan over a longer period of time.
Yeah, I think the other thorn in that particular issue, and I completely agree, and I think you're absolutely right, is that whilst you've got central government and funding scenarios, it's local politics that then comes into play, because if you have a change of leader, you have a change of party, that in charge of the local authority, there's always a change of emphasis, there's always a change of direction, which then causes lots of issues in each of the departments, which always filters down to property in terms of use. And I've certainly seen it where projects have literally just been cancelled overnight because that's not the flavour of the month with whoever's now leading the council. So there is a certain amount of that inherent in local authorities, I think. Less so, I think, in blue light organisations and the NHS. I think that's slightly different. But in terms of local authorities, that plays out on a regular basis because of the electoral system that we have. I think for those local authorities where it doesn't change, then you could probably see there is a bit more of a longer term plan. I mean, certainly I would cite in Nottingham the long-term commitment to get the tram delivered was because of stable politics, basically, because Labour were in charge and the same key people that were really, really supportive, had done the research, long-term commitment, and it was a 20 to 25 year commitment to get that tram built, to get the funding, so it can happen, but I think that's a good example where long-term stable politics is good. If you're changing leader and if you're changing party every 3 to 5 years, I suggest that probably isn't going to happen.
On that sort of connection, connecting or connected to that point, James, do you think as well that the public sector is very quick to damn itself? But there is a good example, isn't it, of a really good plan that has delivered in spade loads. I mean, if I look, in the West Midlands, the tram between Birmingham and Wolverhampton, what a fantastic service that was. I look at some regeneration projects that I was involved with Wolverhampton, initially as agent, but then when I was seconded, well, I'm going to name it, Blake and Hall Gardens. What a fantastic project that was. And the city's never got the recognition for delivering that project. I'd like to think that's what we can do, is almost, without overplaying our position, advocates for the public sector. There are some great examples of where the public sector has really delivered. I mean, again, I'd look at just north of Wolverhampton, I-54. That was an Advantage West Midlands project going back in history, and sadly show my age there. But that was a long-term vision that has massively delivered. And I think rather than knocking, it's praising, isn't it? And I think there's insufficient praise at the moment in terms of where we have, or where the public sector has been successful.
Yeah, I think it's some of it's, I suppose, wrapped up in things like the HS2, isn't it, where it's easy to criticise, and goodness knows what a disaster that's been from a budgetary perspective. But just circling back to what we were involved, so Brute Knowles were the land and property agents to support Nottingham City Council in delivering the tram. What the City Council did really well from the outset was appointed a director to be in charge of it, put a team together internally, a consistent team that we worked with for 12 years. Yeah. And it worked really, really well. And there was lots of support and focus from senior people in the local authority. And you could just sense it was a genuine commitment to the whole project from concept through to completion. And it was done very, very successfully. But you're right. I don't think it got the plaudits it deserves, because people are, I'm afraid as a country, we're probably a bit too quick to criticise. It's like the Channel Tunnel, I can remember at the time, an engineering masterpiece is how you can describe it, and nothing other. Two engineering teams from two countries meeting in the middle under the channel. I mean, but my God, all the negative press around it at the time, people love to harp and criticise. And I think we notice it in the CPO team when we do lots and lots of work for local authorities around transport, so obviously trams, roads. There's just a whole, people resist it because they don't want the scheme to happen in the first place, and because of that it then tends to feed in a lack of understanding about the compensation process itself. People think that, compensation in the UK is, well, you're going to give me double my house value and away I go. Well, it just doesn't work like that. The compensation code isn't set up in that way. You are compensated to the point where you're not going to be any worse off. Plus other mitigating factors. But, government doesn't do a particularly very good job, I don't think, of managing the hearts and minds of the UK public around infrastructure playing out at the moment in terms of solar and wind and all the things that we need to do. But it's the same with roads. It's no different. The schemes that we act on, you still get the same level of objections and a lack of understanding. But it's all integrated into, certainly in the West Midlands and East Midlands, providing reliable infrastructure that gets people to work, gets them to, enjoy socialising and spending money in Birmingham and Nottingham stuff, and creates a modern city that people want to live and work in.
James, kind of making the connection, therefore, in terms of the message, part, therefore, of generating the support for projects is making sure that the message is very clearly spelt out, so that the wider population can support a project because they understand what the objectives are and what the outputs and benefits are going to be. And I think making the connection back to devolution, I think this is where it's hoped, isn't it, Guy? Making your point in particular, that devolution is going to help, because as opposed to, can I say, for example, Whitehall not possibly being able to understand, what's happening across the country, because they're just not present, are they, in everything that's happening across the country at any one time? They just can't be. So I think that's where devolution is going to help, isn't it? Because that message, if we go back in history, regional spatial strategies, as far as I'm concerned, looking back, they were successful because they did generate a rapport with the local community with whom they were working.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said for localism, isn't there? In understanding those local and regional issues, there's no doubt about that. I think Westminster's been proved over many years to be pretty poor at that in terms of that granular understanding. So, devolution should deliver on that. And out of that greater understanding, hopefully there's a recognition of what the actual needs are. Because what tends to happen is government bundles up money and says to local authorities, well, you can bid for it on the basis of this criteria for certain things or certain regeneration. doesn't necessarily fit in with what's actually required in that area, particularly if you're trying to pump prime other development or enhancements in social welfare or housing regeneration. As surveyors in our regions, despite doing national work, we all know the hotspots. We all know the sites that have been undeveloped for years because they're problem sites. That's the whole reason. The market hasn't chosen to do it because there's lots and lots of issues around that site. So if devolution is going to provide a new emphasis, then I'm pretty comfortable that there would certainly be better local knowledge around where to develop and where not to develop.
And that's going to rely on a couple of things, isn't it? One is very strong leadership, and we've seen that with some of the existing mayors out there. Yeah. But also just, I don't know, an acceptance at the authority level, but also at the individual and community level that things have to happen, things have to change. Housing needs to be built, infrastructure needs to be provided. And, there are positives of localism, but there are also negatives. And that tends to be the sort of NIMBYism that inevitably creeps in. And that needs to be overridden. Or at least, if it's not going to be overridden, it needs to be understood.
I think that's the key point, Guy, understanding. And that comes down to leadership having a very clear vision as to what it's trying to achieve. So, for example, it's a piece of work we've recently been involved with for the Combined Authority. It was a place pilot project, actually. And when we were reviewing the projects, it was very clearly set out that deliverability is the mantra of the new government. We have got to start delivering on some of these projects.
Let's just pick up on that, because I think that is a really, really good point, because I think my public sector experience tells me that really in terms of delivering projects, I think where I would level some criticism historically is that there's an awful lot of projects that have sat on the shelf because they've just been too grand. I mean, every local authority in every small town was doing town centre redevelopment in the 90s and 2000s where, sweeping buildings away to develop a public realm, etc., and trying to cure the problems of the high street without recognising what they were and why they were, because the whole change in society and the way that it shops and socialises, you're almost swimming against the tide. And we've all seen it, the big fancy model, the red edge around a plan that takes in half the town centre, which then, because it's not developed, sterilises anyone else doing anything with it and puts them off. For me, I've just seen far too many projects that are just too grand, whether it's town centre redevelopment or other things. It's I think what I'd like to see, hopefully as part of devolution, is just some common sense around what's low-hanging fruit, what can be achieved sensibly, and what, as you've just said, what can we deliver? Well, you need to deliver smaller scale things that develop employment.
It's baby steps.
Housing.
It's baby
not
steps.
The big
set
bang
around,
theory.
Yeah, set baby steps, set around a vision. I've always thought that in terms of regeneration, the role of the public sector is to pump private sector investments.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the public sector creates it sets the scene, doesn't it? It puts the bits in the necessary infrastructure, the environment.
Yeah, I mean, one area that I've noticed over the years is that this retraction has been based on the need to generate money to fill in gaps in budgets. But, the slow and inevitable move away from what I would describe as the sort of the county industrial estate, where you've got sort of smaller industrial units that support startup businesses and smaller businesses that represent good value for money, nice, decent buildings, 750 square feet, 1,500 square feet, something like that. Courtyard schemes, they've disappeared from that public sector realm. I mean, some local authorities have got some left, but I mean, they were great at really starting to pump prime employment in areas because they gave a small startup facility to new businesses. And in truth, certainly the local authorities I've acted for, I think we've done one courtyard scheme in the last 8 years, and we were responsible for letting it, and it let within 5-6 months completely, because it was good value for money, clean, modern space, but it was small. It was suited to startup businesses or businesses that wanted to move on to the next level. And it creates employment, and it creates support for companies to grow in that area, in that local authority's area. And whenever you mention it at local authority level, it's just, I'm afraid, not perceived as sexy enough or shiny enough or big enough. And I don't really understand why. It does go back to this Big Bang Theory that it has to be something that everybody can stand in front of and cut the ribbon, and it's really, really big. So, it needs a change of emphasis.
If we're going to grow the nation and, improve productivity, and I think one of the recognitions, and this is not political comment, this is, I think, a reality, isn't it? That if we are going to, over a period of time, pay down the nation's debt, afford all of the frontline services that the country is going to have to spend money on, the nation has to grow. It has to grow economically.
Absolutely.
And there are too many at the moment barriers to some of the fantastically innovative people we have out there. It's absolutely wrong, isn't it, that somebody who has a brilliant business idea is unable to put it into practice because they cannot find affordable premises. And again, this isn't political, it's reduced cost or increased taxation. And of course, my own particular view, and this is not political, is that ultimately to encourage investment, taxation is probably better reduced to encourage private sector investment.
Or at least targeted around generating wealth and in terms of employment and businesses. I think you have to be careful with taxation. I think you can use it as a blunt instrument, which seems to be what's happening, or you can use it to incentivize, because I think if you do it well, then everybody wins. People developing businesses can win, and then the exchequer wins because that growth comes through in a 3 to 5 year period. I think we're definitely a blunt instrument at the moment, which unfortunately is playing out the way that it's playing out. Back sort of full circle to our consultancy role and a property focus is really to, as we've been alluding to, is to help support realistic delivery around property solutions that I suppose add more value than just the sum of their parts, because I think we've all pleasingly experienced schemes where, done well, whether it's large scale regeneration or just small scale, it doesn't have to be large scale. The wider benefits are, play out really, really well in terms of economic growth, employment, less social issues, etc. So it needs to be done. And you would hope, goodness, you would hope there's enough good examples out there for people to follow to avoid making mistakes that we've highlighted in the past where it's just been too grand, it's just been too big. And the truth is, people can't, local authorities can't afford it at the end of the day. And the pressures around, just turning to blue light organisations, again, operationally, they've got lots and lots of pressures, particularly from the work that I've been doing on decarbonisation for these. They're right up against it. They've got to come up with completely different ways of working. If you're going to have electric ambulances and fire engines, etc., that is a whole new way of operationally working. Their buildings are going to be in the wrong place because it's all about having high voltage electricity supply, which if you're delivering an ambulance service in Wales, crikey, how challenging is that?
When you say that, James, Guy, I mentioned this the other day, I'm struck by the phrase prevention is better than cure. So if we're kind of looking to reduce the pressure on the NHS, for example, without wishing to patronise people, education is a really important part of this process, isn't it? Prevent the problems occurring in the first place.
Yeah. Yes, I was kind of just bringing that link back to our role, but also the public sector's role. Economic growth is fed by development, and development is fed by the planning system, and that's a big role for the public sector. And I know that the government been pretty critical of the planning system overall, seem pretty determined to change it. There's talk of mandatory training for planning committee members next year. Talks of national scheme of delegation for allocated sites to make sure that they're not double-handled, as they call it. They want to reduce the number of decisions that get refused at first instance, only to be granted at appeal, because that causes really frustrating and significant delay, and that going back to our delivery point, but it also incurs significant and often hidden costs dealing with this sort of thing. So, the local authorities have got a real role to play. And for some, that might be a change of mindset, mightn't it? But for others, I think it's going to be business as usual, but it's going to require bulldozers in both cases. Both the physical, but also the metaphorical, because ultimately this development has to happen to assist economic growth, and we can't be too much of a NIMBY.
Yeah, I agree. I think it plays out at major infrastructure level as well, doesn't it? Where if we're to get things done as a country, it has to be done a lot quicker, and that really is about restricting the amount of objection procedures that take place, because it as we know, delay equals cost, and that's played out unfortunately quite badly in a lot of infrastructure schemes, particularly HS2, where when we say cost, we're not just talking a few £1 million, we are talking significant amounts of money. So if we're to be smarter about delivering housing, regen, infrastructure, etc., government is right. They've woken up to the fact that, there is far too many bureaucratic layers. There's far too many opportunities for people to object. And the point about that is that, and we see it on CPO schemes, even if the objection isn't material, people are still allowed to object. Therefore, the delay of 6 months only to find out that objection wasn't material doesn't negate the process. They've still got the 6 months to object. So it does need looking at. And also, I think, really, as we sort of close on this, is the issue around just what I would best describe as sort of standard property for all public bodies, is that there's lots of obsolescence, there's lots of older buildings, there's the changes around decarbonisation and 2030 targets. From where I sit, I mean, we're really, really going to struggle as a country to deliver those, because there isn't the money. There hasn't been the staff trained to understand decarbonisation. There isn't the funding to retrofit listed buildings or to move out of them and to dispose of them and come up with a new building for shared services. All of this takes time, but the truth is some local authorities are finding out people don't want to lose their town hall. It's been the centre of their town for 150, 200 years. It's very often faces out onto the public realm, the square. We've got to be really careful that we don't drive dogma to such an extent that it changes our towns and cities for the worst just because politically, someone decided it was a good idea to commit to 2030, not 2050. I would politely suggest that 2050 was more realistic in terms of deliverability, training, planning and financial management. 2030 is proving, as we all thought, very unrealistic. So let's just circle around as a conclusion then, the three of us picked over the bones of quite a bit there, which is not surprising because I think as a sector I do genuinely feel sorry for it because it has an awful lot of operational and non-operational issues that are in many respects multi-layered, very difficult to obfuscate and just think it's really difficult for them. I mean, Ian, what do you if we said the next sort of 3 to 5 years, what do you think the sort of couple of big challenges are for public sector organisations?
Strategy is the one, an agreed strategy. Number 2, delivering that strategy based around the resources that are truly required.
And presumably 3, one should inform the other.
Well, one should inform the other. And I suppose number 3, with all of this being realistic.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
I have seen too many master plans prepared, not by property people, by the way, by people who consider themselves to be property-based people, but they're probably no disrespect, but they are in other professions. And I honestly don't think they're realistic because they're not property people and they're not truly market-facing.
Great. Thanks, Ian. Guy?
Yeah, I think Ian's articulated 3 very good reasons. I think, we can't escape from the funding point at all because that drives everything within this sector. That combined with the ones that Ian's mentioned probably covers it, but it's where taking that initial advice from consultants like ourselves and getting involved at the start, not the end, injecting some commercial reality around the plans. It's held us in good stead in the past, and it should in the future. Now, devolution is obviously it's a real opportunity for firms like us. But there's there remains such a lot of uncertainty as to how it pans out. And who at a particular authority is still going to be there next time around, that it makes it quite difficult to focus. The best we can do is to continue delivering good quality work on time, to support what they're doing at a sort of day-to-day activities, through to large project consultancy work. But let's try and be the realistic face of moving forward.
And I'd like to say, Guy, just finally, let's be positive. This nation's got so many great things to offer. It's got a history which has one thing, and that's experience. We've got brilliant brains in this country. We've just got to assemble the dots, haven't we, in such a way that they are all aligned in a way that can move forward to this, whatever the vision is going to be. And that it's been positive. That would be my message.
That's a good way to end, Ian. I think the only thing I would probably add from what you two guys have said is that I think the devolution thing is interesting. What I wouldn't like to see is that they disappear down a rabbit hole for 2 to 3 years whilst it's all about integration, because I think that is the great danger, is that merging public entities of scale, it's potentially a car crash, isn't it? And I think that's going to take, from an IT and organisational perspective, not just money, but time. And within that, I'm 100% convinced that the organisations themselves won't be fit for purpose in terms of decision making and deliverability around projects, regeneration, etc., because there'll just be too much focus on the internal issues. So I think devolution potentially is good in some respects, but I think that practical aspect of it is we can't lose sight of. It's emerging 3 or 4 local authorities. Definite car crash there in terms of how much time and money it's going to take to come out with proper integration in terms of data, operational services, etc. So we shall see. So that brings us to the end of today's episode. We hope it's given you a clearer view of the realities and the opportunities facing the public sector in 2025 and beyond. From navigating funding pressures and skill shortages to embracing devolution, net zero and regeneration, this is a pivotal moment for local authorities and public bodies. And through it all, Bruton Knowles continues to play a trusted, long-term role supporting teams with practical advice, commercial insight, and the hands-on delivery needed to turn plans into outcomes that truly benefit communities. A huge thank you to our guests Guy Emmerson and Ian Mercer for sharing their insight and experience. If you'd like to learn more about how Bruton Knowles partners with the public sector, from estate management and valuation to development consultancy and regeneration, visit brutonknowles.co.uk. And as always, don't forget to follow or subscribe to Landmark on your favourite podcast platform so you'll never miss an episode. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.